it may appear at first glance, and as much as I'd love to see career diplomats appointed in more places, maybe even all places, I know in my heart that that's not going to work. And by the way, we're not the only country that does that. We do it perhaps more blatantly than other countries. But you go back and review, for example, the ambassadors from the United Kingdom in Washington and their political appointees, because they have access to the Prime Minister, and a career diplomat does not have direct personal access to the Prime Minister. And the same is true of France and in other countries. They appoint people that they can rely on, that they know will interpret their administration correctly to the American authorities. Is that helpful, Mark? Sir?
Ioji, o secundă, îți dau un microfon imediat, aș vrea numai din instinct, dar continuăm. Mergi în continuare, probabil. Dar în rolul meu de moderator simt nevoia să adaug cât de scurt posibil, pentru că îmi dau seama că pentru o parte a asistenței, pentru partea mai tânără a asistenței, poate că toată explicația asta nu e foarte clară. Pentru că e un sistem politic și o anumită cultură politică americană implicată în această tema a numirii, a desemnării ambasadorilor. Ceea ce se numește, și domnul Latham a folosit expresiile tradiționale, ceea ce se numește în politica americană career diplomat, diplomat de carieră și respectiv numit politic, înseamnă diplomați, adică personalul Ministerului de Externe american, să zicem, adică Departamentul de Stat, care sunt oameni care asta au ca meserie, lucrează decenii în șir, se educă în direcția asta și ajung să aibă stagii în diverse ambasade din lume și dintre ei, cei mai importanți, cei care au experiență, sunt numiți ambasadori în anumite țări. Dar există tradiția americană, care se folosește sigur și în alte părți și la noi, de a numi și la noi, de a numi ambasadori, nu diplomați, nu numai diplomați de carieră, ci așa numiți political appointees, adică numiți politic, pe care președintele american îi alege el ca numiți politic de către el, de obicei dintre apropiați sau sprijinitori ai lui. De asta toată discuția despre faptul că acești numiți politic, care sunt priviți de către Departamentul de Stat puțin mai câși, pentru că vin din afara sistemului diplomatic, totuși pot avea un avantaj, pot aduce un avantaj extraordinar pentru ambasadele americane din țările unde sunt numiți asemenea oameni, pentru că au contactul direct cu președintele, pe care un funcționar expert, diplomat de carieră din Departamentul de Stat nu-l are, nu poate ajunge la președinte, nu se ajunge așa de ușor în biroul oval despre care am fost vorba din auri. E vorba, în cazuri uneori, am avut aici destui political appointees like Alfred Moses and others more recently. Sunt oameni care pot fi James Roosevelt, oameni care pot fi proeminenți în alte domenii, în NGO-uri, în ONG-uri americane, oameni de afaceri. În multe cazuri sunt oameni care au contribuit substanțial prin donații la campaniile electorale ale președinților, care după aceea îi răsplătesc pe unii dintre cei care, sigur, sunt cât de cât potriviți pentru un asemenea rol și pot performa ca ambasadori Americii în lume. Și sistemul ăsta funcționează. Eu simt prea nedești, te rog.
My question is there is there agreed upon quota or ratio between political appointees and career diplomats agreed between the trade union, foreign service and powers that be?
The answer is no. And it does vary from administration to administration. Never do the political appointees hit 50%. So you will always have career diplomats in the majority of posts, but they may not be the most important posts in the biggest countries.
Second question, what is the level, the lecture level nowadays of the people studying at FSI, Foreign Service Institute, Romanian studies and area studies and language? Is it, you were there for a number of years, so is it increasing or decreasing?
The capability or the intellectual standards? Well, you know,
The profile.
well, the older I get, the more incompetent they look. But this is simply an old man talking. Old men always see things in that light. There has been, of course, a major shift in American life, and it's reflected in the Foreign Service. It occurred in the 60s and 70s, when, as it's, in a sense, all of the federal government, all of American society opened up to much greater diversity. When I joined the Foreign Service in 1966, the great joke was the American Foreign Service was pale, male, and Yale. Pale as in white race, male as in male gender, and Yale as in Ivy League. And I hit that profile. But obviously, you could not represent a country as diverse as mine is by continuing to leave it in the hands of pale male Yale graduates. So there was a great emphasis on diversity.
I was asking because in the early 90s, a few months, I was a teacher of Romanian there.
At the FSI?
At FSI, for a while, just replacing my wife, who was pregnant. And I found people so eager to learn about Romanian, so interested in Romanian things, even though coming from very, very unusual backgrounds, I mean, color-wise and education-wise, but really ready to learn. I think more alien studies in a way, because some of them were not very talented to learn the language, but they did their utmost. And I was just interested in, because I left a long time ago in the States, and I was interested in learning if it goes upwards or stagnates.
Yeah. I would think that it is probably inching upwards. The drive for diversity is over. The diversity happens of its own accord now. It does not require special recruiting or anything of that sort any longer. And the number of people who take the Foreign Service exam, to get into the Foreign Service, there are basically two hurdles. There is a written exam, and then there is a personal interview before a board of usually 3 Foreign Service officers.
Plus a review of one's background.
Oh yes, but that's handled as a field
Previous to the exam itself.
No, actually, the field investigation takes place before a person is accepted. To pass the 2 hurdles does not automatically get you into the Foreign Service. At that point, a field investigation takes place to look at your background and so on, to see whether there is suspect things.
It's more pragmatic, more American to have that review after having selected people able to serve. It is more European or Romanian to think that that's been done previous to the exam.
Well, I think part of it's economy. It's very expensive to do a field investigation. They had an advantage with me because I had been a naval officer for a number of years, and so a naval officer, yes, and therefore they had pretty well a good track record on me. I was partly overseas. I did sort of.
Have a little bit of a look of a officer.
Well, if you ask my daughter, she will tell you I have the personality of one. But that aside,
look de mare. What's the English for that? Expresia asta, look de mare. We call look de mare a very experienced sailor.
Well, that was many, many years ago. But they had that advantage. You see, the federal government had a good, close look at me. So my field examination was going just fine until they discovered that my father, long deceased, had owned stock in a Canadian mine. And question came, you know, you have financial interests overseas. Well, the mine had gone bankrupt years before. In any case, my mother was still living, and she was the heir, not me, of my father's property. But this tied them up for a while until I could convince them that I was not a part owner of the indoor mines in Ontario. I eventually did get that squared away, and as you see, I did go into the Foreign Service. The written exam is given to anybody who wants to take it, and thousands do. I think the last time it was given, something like 35,000 Americans took the written exam. You know, it's hugely subscribed to. Well,
by the way, what's the size? Do you know that? The size of the
an incoming
Foreign
class?
Service? No, the Foreign Service itself. Worldwide, how many tens or hundreds of thousands?
No. The Foreign Service is a very small branch of the government. For some reason or other, the number 6,000 kicks around in my mind, and that would be about true, I think. It's very small, and they represent a minority of the Department of State. Most of the employees of the Department of State are not Foreign Service at all, they're civil servants. Working in Washington or in our passport offices around the United States as civil servants, carrying GS numbers, not Foreign Service numbers.
So the 35,000 were
It's
running for some tens or hundreds of
less than
available jobs.
Less than 500 a year. And of course, a large number of people don't pass the exam. But those who do go into an oral exam, and that is the real cutthroat exam. You meet these 3 Foreign Service officers, you're seated outside, you're given biographical sheets on those 3 to kind of level the playing field, because they've got a lot of information about you, you've got a little bit about them, and you go in there and you've got less than an hour to make it or break it. And it is a subjective process. In my own case, it just so happened that I had an acquaintance in common with one of the members of my panel, which I think gave me a foot up. But that was a coincidence. I didn't know going into the offices. My exam took place in New York at the American Mission to the United Nations. Other people are in New York, go to Washington, and so on. Mine was in New York. And it just so happened that one of the officers on my panel and I had a common acquaintance. And we talked about that common acquaintance for a part of the time. And then we talked about what was then a burning issue in American diplomacy, Castro's Cuba, and I can't remember the other subjects we discussed. But that's the real make it or break it. And you learn when you leave that day whether you pass the oral exam or not. And at that point comes the field investigation, and they start worrying about my father's stocks in Canadian mines. Other questions?
How come the department has
Stai puțin.
how come your department has had so little information about Romania before I found that a huge mistake?
Well, I'm not sure it was true of the department. I think it was true of America at large. And when I talked about having a certain expertise, it was not being necessarily used by the Department of State, although in part it was. But it was used by the Smithsonian Institution, the Committee on Strategic Studies. Number of universities invited me to come and lecture on Romanian topics. Arizona State University, St. Norbert's in Wisconsin, various organizations. I did an awful lot of lecturing at Rotary clubs and that sort of thing. Not necessarily because there was ignorance in the State Department, but there was throughout the United States less awareness of Romania.
înțeles, sper că am înțeles corect, că ați fost în România comunistă a lui Ceaușescu, ca diplomat.
Da.
Deci, ca diplomat vă întreb, cum vi se pare situația politică a României mai dezastruoasă pe timpul comunismului lui Ceaușescu, după lovitura de stat pe timpul comunismului lui Iliescu și companie? Pentru că, vedeți dumneavoastră, la noi, în Parlamentul României, avem o troglodiția de securiști români care nu vor să stea acasă, că trebuie ei să câștige. Păi, ce să facem, domnule? Asta este situația. În România încă nu se respectă drepturile omului. Ce să facem? Ei sunt foarte activi. Nu noi, care ar trebui să fim activi. Ei merg primii. Ei au furat fondurile lui Ceaușescu, nu noi care suntem amenziți. Deci, situația este așa cum este, iar corupția, care este atroce în România, a afectat absolut toate structurile, inclusiv structura de securitate, care dă și infiltrați fiind în toate partidele, dau această tentă negativă de gașcă. Partidele au această tentă de gașcă, din păcate, din cauza lor. Nu din cauza mea, dacă mă duc să mă scriu într-un partid, eu nu pot să dau tentă de gașcă unui partid. Deci cum mi se pare dumneavoastră ca cetățean american și din păcate situația politică mai dezastruoasă? Comunismul lui Ceaușescu sau comunismul de acum?
Da.
Vă mulțumesc.
Well, you can't imagine I'm crazy enough to put my foot in that hole.
Înțelegeți, doamnă? Vă imaginați că sunt atât de nebun ca să vârg piciorul în crăpătura asta?
There are some significant differences here which have to be underlined. When Ceausescu left office, he did so at the muzzle of an AK-47. When Iliescu left office, he left so because he was voted out once. And that's a great deal of difference. As to corruption, as I already indicated earlier, corruption existed in, I suppose, in both periods, both eras. Corruption is, of course, a term of art, not a term of science. I used to brief congressional delegations that came into Romania, and I would mention that I was born in the Archdiocese of Boston in the days of James Michael Curley. My first adult employment was in law enforcement in Cook County, Chicago, on the Chicago waterfront. My first assignment in the Foreign Service was in Beirut in the days of the Intrabank scandal. And then I have never seen corruption like I've seen now in communist Romania. And believe me, I had a long background dealing with corruption. So it's, as I say, it's a term of art, not of science. What constitutes corruption? And in some societies, corruption, what an American or more likely an Englishman might view as corruption, in another society is viewed as generosity, or simply part of the deal. I mean, it's part of the exchange. It's one side of the equation. As I say, it's a term of art, not a term of science. There is no scientific definition known to me which is applicable to the issue of corruption. Having said that, I'm going to forbear to get into a discussion of how the communist Romania differs from the present day, except to know that when you throw a president out of office, you no longer have a Kalashnikov to do it. And that is a significant difference.
Maybe I might rephrase in a way previous question and ask you probably the standard question which you get and which foreigners visiting our country do get, and foreigners everywhere in the world get from the locals, namely, how do you see, what's your view of today's Romania? You have visited the country over and over again, you have seen communist Romania and so on, you have seen Romania immediately after the revolution, turmoil, so that epoch And what is your view, your perception of Romania now, being again in Bucharest in April 2013?
Well, generally it's positive, because I do see progress. One of the essays in this book is entitled Romania Quo Vadis? Romania, where are you going? And I wrote it shortly after the revolution. I delivered it at an American Romanian Academy conference in California in the summer of 93. And I began that essay by recalling a conversation I had had in the 1980s with a Romanian poet whom I'd gotten to know I thought well enough to ask him if the present regime, the communist regime, were to disappear, how long do you think it would take Romanian culture to go back and reconnect with Romania inter bellica? And the poet replied, about 2 weeks. And then, sometime thereafter, I met a man who was experienced in Romanian matters, had been here as a Fulbright student, spoke the language, and I asked him the same question. How long would it take Romania now to reconnect with the inter bellica? And he replied, 1 year for every year of communism. Well, my poet friend has proven to be a better poet than prophet, and the American has still got several years to go on his prediction. But I'm optimistic about Romania, and I'm much encouraged by what Ambassador Rosa Pepe once said in Washington at a gathering in the context of the Smithsonian, when he said, "There's nothing wrong with Romania. They can't be cured by what's right about Romania." And as you get pessimistic and discouraged, do try to remember that there are many virtues about Romania which balance this, and may indeed serve to counteract it in time.
Can you now tell us the name of that poet?
No, I'm not. No, I'm not going to.
He's alive.
He's alive.
He's alive. Do you think he or she would be very much ashamed of that prognosis?
Well,
Why keep the secret?
no, I don't think he's ashamed of it. It just so happens I spoke with him within the last week, and he had read the essay and heard himself being quoted without name for the first time, and we had a laugh about it. So he's taking it in good shape.
Okay, then let me try another way. What are, as a cultural attaché, 83 to 87, okay,
Yep.
in Bucharest, however close the regime was, difficult to contact people and so on and so forth, as a cultural attaché, not only as a PhD postgraduate, so as a Bucharest, you did meet people. Give us names. Whom did you meet at the time? Writers, actors, theater directors, whatever.
Yes.
Painters and so on. Give us, if possible, a list as long as you can recall.
Well, I'll just pull out a few examples. I met your actor, Belian. I met Ion Karamitru. Very famous. I met Baba, the painter. These were all the people, and the others, that, of course, were cleared to meet with foreign diplomats. The average person on the street didn't want anything to do with diplomats, and well advised they were. For example, I was here as a single parent. I came in '83 with a 3-year-old daughter, and she made friends with Romanian children in the neighborhood. I lived on Strada Plantelor, and they would in the house and have ice cream, and they came to her birthday parties. Not one of the parents ever set foot in my house, nor did I ever talk to any of them. And picking up conversation was very difficult. There were a couple of exceptions. One were the lines, the infamous lines. As a matter of policy, whenever I saw a line in Romania, I got in it. For two reasons. One, because I was curious what was going to happen at the end of the line. Whether they were going to be selling honey or women's underwear, or what was going to happen at the end of the line.
Ready to buy.
Well, I was ready to observe and perhaps report on it. In any event, the other advantage of being in a line was it was one of the few places where you could talk to Romanians. And they would talk to you. And you'd get in the line, couldn't talk to the person behind you because they could see you, but you could talk to the person in front. And of course, they knew from my accent that I was certainly not a Romanian. But as long as they didn't see me, they could plausibly deny. I give you even more dramatic example. One December, I was up in a antiquariat. I frequent antiquariats, as you've heard, up on Stefan Chomare. And I'd been in this antiquariat before, so the woman who was running it didn't know who I was, but knew what my interests were. And she came up to me and said, "You're still interested in history?" And I said, "Yes." "Well, there's a man in here who's got some books on Romanian history he wants to sell. Would you like to meet him?" Well, of course I said yes. And I eventually wound up in his apartment in one of the big blocks on Dorabans. And he did have some books that interested me. Yorga, Xenopol, and we had a cup of tea. He gave me a cup of tea, and we were sitting there, and I happened to notice on his desk a picture of a man in a naval officer's uniform, dressed whites, and they're very distinctive. They look the same in any navy in the world. And so I asked him, I said, "Who's that?" And he said, "Well, that's my brother. He was in the merchant marine, the mercantile navy, and he lost his life and was buried at sea." And I said, I was a naval officer myself. Well, he knew well enough that I wasn't a Romanian from my accent. And so he said, "Oh, in the East German Navy?" Since I was, the only other possibility was the East German Navy, and I spoke with, I suppose, a slightly Germanic guttural accent. And I said, no, I wasn't in the East German Navy. And he said, "Well, what Navy were you in?" Now you have to see the situation. I'm sitting in his home and I'm drinking his tea.
Also buying his books.
And I'm also about to buy his books. But I didn't want to put him in an embarrassing position ultimately, in case I had been followed, which was frequently the case. So I said, "Știți, domnule, nu vreți să știți." Now that's very rude. He's asking him an honest question, and I'm enjoying his hospitality. And you can see sort of a puzzled and somewhat angry expression cross his face until he realized what I had done. And he said, "Vă mulțumesc foarte mult." You see, it was that kind of a situation. I was giving him plausible denial. So had somebody come knocking on his door in half an hour, he could say, "I had no idea who that person was." If I had said I was an American lieutenant commander, he would have been in serious trouble.
You took the risk of doing that. Was it clear to you that it was a danger to go to the house of someone? It was in the last years, in the second half of the 80s, it was becoming pretty unprecedented regulators more than before. The contact of foreigners to Romanians. Did you have any feeling of danger yourself?
No, I didn't. Again, I was shielded by my diplomatic passport. I mean, the Romanian government did not want an diplomatic incident with the United States government. And so they would have declared me persona non grata and required me to leave the country within a very few days. Had I done something which they had caught and didn't like. But I didn't have any risk. I never felt the slightest bit personally in danger when I was in Romania. Yes, that's why I wouldn't tell him what naval service I had been in. And he couldn't plausibly deny. He said, this person wants to buy some books, so I invited him up the house and look at the books. And I have no idea who he was. And I don't know anything about him. We didn't talk about him. And, this Critica could say, well, it's an American naval officer, it's an American diplomat. He could say, I knew nothing about that. And be absolutely truthful. Yes, I would avoid endangering people. And I was conscious of the fact that I carried an electric charge and could very easily embarrass, if not endanger, my people that I associated with, and I would quite consciously avoid doing that.
Aici ar fi de adăugat, dați iarăși voie să moderez puțin, ar fi de adăugat că după povestea asta expresivă și care spune mult despre un regim de dictatură, că totuși au fost epoci, perioade destul de confuze și cu cazuri foarte diverse. Vlad Aghir era deja emigrat spre sfârșitul anilor 80 și n-a avut diferențe directe despre sfârșitul anilor 80, deși, în adevăr, legislația interzicea, cum se spunea atunci, relațiile cu străini. Și legea cerea ca dacă ai un contact cu un străin, să declare acest lucru autorităților. Se putea întâmpla în urma unor asemenea contacte, dar puteau fi și întâmplătoare. Pe stradă, nu erau mulți străini în România, dar erau. Se mai întâmpla. Se putea întâmpla să fii contactat de autorități respective de securitate, mai degrabă, ca să te întrebi să faci. Deci toate lucrurile astea se puteau întâmpla, dar s-au întâmplat și numeroase alte cazuri de contacte, numai cărora nici poți nimic și nu te întreba nimeni. Eu am asemenea experiențe începând de la întâlniri întâmplătoare în tren, când am reușit, tânăr fiind, să țin în România 2 zile, i-am luat la mine acasă și am culcat pe niște studenți suedezi ca să descopere și ei în România, pentru că, mă rog, să ia decizia să plece repede în altă parte și ajungând până la vizitele celebre din epocă, știu și Gabriel și alții ambasadori olandezi cu stop la domiciliile noastre, e adevărat că era lumea literară, intelectuală, culturală, care avea alt tip de protecție, să spunem, în sensul că eram necunoscuți, eram susținuți de Europa Liberă, de BBC, de posturile străine, în fine, au fost cazuri și cazuri. Gabriel Andrescu sau Vivian Totov au avut asemenea experiențe probabil mai către extrema radicală a represiunii sistemului, pentru că ei deja puseră gesturi disidente și orice contact cu străinii era deja un pericol politic și atunci asta a însemnat și anchete și arestări și alte lucruri.
Și poate și ei au mai scăpat, adică o parte din întâlnirile astea puteau să le mai scăpat.
Da, autoritățile nu le-au sesizat, efectiv. În fine, vreau să spun că epoca a fost așa, dar, de fapt, a fost și în multe feluri și greu de descris finalmente, după părerea mea, într-un diagnostic net și concis. La fel cum este foarte greu să accept și un diagnostic atât de concis privitor la faptul că, de pildă, Parlamentul este plin de securiști și toate partidele fac o confrerie și așa mai departe, deși vă respect punctul de vedere, dar am o opinie mult mai extinsă, să zicem așa, care include și, ce spuneți dumneavoastră, dar include și multe alte lucruri, pentru că viața e mai diversă, iar dictatura comunistă de după stalinism, după Gheorghiu Dej în România, n-a mai fost atât de homogenă și de clară și de violent, represivă, cum fusese. That much for a brief comment, rather give it more.
Was some sort of self-understood that no one was in life danger if you contacted them. We know that. But I always wondered, before I left, I was 85, so at least 5 most beautiful years of dictatorship. I've always wondered how the famous Mr. Stork and others, and other contacts, my contacts, felt from the other side. What the diplomat has to tell just anecdotes, just that's exactly might be very interesting for a book. That's the kind of story I expected. So.
Recent, Wikileaks a afișat de zeci de mii de documente legate și de sens. Alte intervenții, alte lucruri. Ioana, adaugi ceva?
Eu aș mai adăuga ceva, eu să fie întrebări de altă.
Întrebări mai așteptăm o dată, de două, de trei ori și putem să începem să facem și o încheiere. Dacă încep să fie înaintate, mai putem încă să mai provorim. Dacă cineva mai vrea să spună ceva, să adauge ceva, să afle ceva de la Ernest H. Latham Jr. That's the full name. Cine ar vrea? Vă rog, scuzați-mă, sunteți exact în dreptul lui.
Very simple. Is it possible after the questions to sit around asking? I'm suggesting this if the question comes to head or just mental
It's working, but it kept taking it away.
I suggest that maybe after the questions are over, we have a little English. That was my question.
Okay, it's a suggestion. It's very welcome. I am calling this kind of evenings, which are weekly. The label is the Critical Cafe, which I'm aware that in English it sounds a little bit critical state, but it means a critical perspective on life, critical intellectuals in the French tradition and so on. And of course we are in a club, in a bar, we can go on and Mr. Latham won't rush out in a minute after we close, so of course we can go on informally. But not before asking once again if there is any more questions. Ask formally, and if not, I will please ask you again to tell us something about your stay here. How did you perceive all this promotion of your book by Editura Vremea and your meetings with the students at the university, the English and American Studies department? And how did you find this Cafeneaua Critica? Not wishing for compliments, but just willing to find out what's your view of this kind of meetings and discussions.
I'll answer that honestly, and you can take it as a compliment or not as you wish. I'm absolutely speechless and dumbfounded. The essays were written in English, and they were intended for an English literate audience. And it was only about a year ago that I conceived of the idea with some encouragement, not least from Mrs. Uranim, to go through my canon and select those things which I thought were of general interest. Some of my more detailed, like scientific, wissenschaftlich writings I did not include. I included no reviews that I had written of books or other things. They were those essays that I thought might have a more general appeal. And so I'm quite dumbfounded that there's interest in Romania in them. I'm flattered, of course, and not least of all because these are apparently going to be translated and published in Romanian. As I said, this was not my intended audience, and 2 months ago I could never have dreamed of sitting here in the Google Art at the Critic Cafe to be discussing the subjects I've discussed this evening. So that's basically the answer. I've taken it as a compliment and wish.
Thank you so much, and thank you for everything you have told us tonight and for being here, accepting our invitation. Mulțumim foarte mult, domnule Latham, și vă dorim numai bine și mulțumesc tuturor că ați fost aici. Eu fac și data